I thought my daughter's backward counting in the bath was just a calming routine until I overheard my husband hiss, "Start again whenever you cry." I picked it up off the tile and it was still warm from his hand. 61 seconds. 62. I stood there in the fogged bathroom, water going cold in the tub, and I let it run because some part of me needed proof that time was still moving normally, that the last 4 minutes had actually happened, and I hadn't slipped into some other version of my life. Maya hadn't moved. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around them, still whispering numbers so quietly I had to lean in to hear. 61. 60. Baby, you can stop. He's gone. I have to get to 0 or it doesn't count. Doesn't count for what? She looked at me like I'd asked her why the sky was blue, like it was the most obvious thing in the world and she couldn't understand why the adult in the room didn't already know it. For it to be a good day, she said, you start over if you cry before 0. I got her out of the water, wrapped her in the towel with the frayed edge, the one she'd had since she was 3, and I held her against my chest and felt her heartbeat going too fast for a 7-year-old who was supposedly just doing a behavioral exercise. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of her bed until 4 a.m., watching her breathe, running the stopwatch through my fingers like a rosary. By morning, I had made 3 decisions. I wasn't going to confront him again. Not yet. I wasn't going to act like nothing happened, and I was going to find out who Rebecca was, because a man doesn't threaten a stranger's mother's entire life to protect a babysitting arrangement. I'd married Caleb Sterling 9 years, 4 months earlier, in a botanical garden in Asheville, under an arch of white peonies he'd picked out himself, because he said, I wouldn't want to be bothered with details. At the time, I'd thought that was thoughtfulness. It took me almost a decade to understand it was the first small hinge on a much larger door, the door to a version of my life where Caleb handled everything, decided everything, and I simply lived inside the house he built around me. He was good at his job, genuinely good, in the way that made it so hard to believe what I now knew. 12 years as the lead counselor at Ridgeline Middle School. Parents drove from 3 districts over to get their kids into his caseload. He'd published 2 papers on adolescent anxiety intervention. The superintendent had his cell number. When Maya was born, half the maternity ward staff knew him by name because he'd counseled their kids. I was a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company and was a job that had, without my noticing, trained me to read documents the way other people read faces. I could smell an inconsistency in a stack of paperwork from across a room. It would matter later. At the time, though, it just meant I filed things. I kept receipts. I kept a mental ledger of small, disqualified worries, filed under nothing, the same way you file a claim you know won't be approved. The nothing had been piling up for over a year. Maya's teacher, Mrs. Okafor, had mentioned in October that Maya seemed to check herself a lot, glancing at the classroom clock, counting under her breath during transitions. I'd told Caleb. He'd smiled and said some kids process anxiety through numeric anchoring, that it was actually a positive coping mechanism he'd taught her himself, something from his training. There'd been the time I found a laminated index card in his car console with a list of names, first names only, and next to each one, a string of numbers I assumed were phone extensions. When I asked, he said it was a peer mentoring roster from the district. I hadn't thought to ask why a peer mentoring roster would be laminated, or why it lived in his car and not his office. There'd been the locked filing cabinet in his home office that had been there since we moved in, that I'd simply stopped noticing the way you stop noticing a stain on a ceiling. There'd been, too, the way Caleb talked about his own childhood, rarely, and only ever in the language of a case study. His father had been emotionally unregulated. His mother had lacked consistent behavioral frameworks. He never said my dad used to lose his temper or my mom checked out on us. He said it the way he said everything, sanded down into clinical distance, like his own upbringing was a file he'd read once rather than a life he'd survived. I used to think that was resilience, strength even, a man who'd turned his own hard childhood into a career built on fixing other people's kids. It never once occurred to me to ask what it costs a person to narrate their own pain in the third person for 30-some years. I know now. It costs the people closest to them, eventually everything. I also remember, and this is the one that keeps me up some nights, turning it over, a dinner party 18 months before the bathtub at the Okonkwo's house down the street, where another counselor from a neighboring district, a woman named Pretty, had a few glasses of wine and started talking about aversive conditioning, like it was old hat. Like everyone at the table had heard of it. Caleb had gotten very animated, very engaged. He'd asked her 3 or 4 pointed follow-up questions, the kind of questions I now understand were less curiosity and more due diligence. I remember thinking, at the time, he's so passionate about his work. I filed it under nothing. Same as everything else. It took me until Detective Webb showed me the forum post to understand that dinner had probably been the night Caleb decided his private research needed a name. Small things. filed under nothing, until the bathtub. The first person I called wasn't a lawyer. It was my sister-in-law, Priya, who'd gone through a custody fight of her own 2 years back, and had come out the other side with a phone full of names. "You don't confront him again," she said, the second I finished telling her. Her voice had gone very flat, very fast. The voice of someone who'd learned this lesson the expensive way. "You document, quietly, everything. Dates, times, exact words if you can remember them. And you talk to someone who does this professionally before you do anything else, because if he's as controlled as you're describing, he already has a story ready for the day you push back." A story about what? About you. I thought about the rabbits comment. One call from a respected colleague like me, and they'll start wondering about the stability of a mother who spends her days talking to imaginary rabbits. It was such a strange, specific threat that I'd almost dismissed it as him being cruel in the moment. But Priya's question made me sit with it differently. He hadn't invented that on the spot. He'd been keeping it in reserve. The next morning, I called Diane Fournier, a family law attorney Priya's friend had used. 19 years of practice. Most of it in cases involving allegations against professionals with community standing. Teachers, clergy, doctors. She had a voice like she'd already heard the worst version of every story before you finished the first sentence, which turned out to be exactly what I needed. "Before anything else," Diane told me in our first call, "I need you to understand something. In cases like this, the person with institutional credibility starts the fight 30 feet ahead of you. Everyone already trusts him. Nobody knows you. Our entire job for the next several weeks is closing that gap with paper, not with your word against his. So what do? You become a documentarian of your own life," she said, "starting today. I want to tell you the next part cleanly, in order, the way it would play out in a movie. Discovery, evidence, confrontation, justice. It wasn't like that. It was slower and uglier and full of moments where I doubted myself so completely that I nearly called the whole thing off. The first loop started 3 days after the bathtub, when I finally worked up the courage to look inside that locked filing cabinet. I told myself it was probably nothing. Old tax documents, insurance forms. The rational adjuster part of my brain kept insisting I was about to feel foolish, that I'd open the drawer and find nothing but expired warranties and Maya's old report cards. Diane had told me not to break any locks, not to force anything that could later be framed as surveillance or harassment in a custody proceeding. So I waited until I found the spare key, taped absurdly to the underside of his desk, like he genuinely believed no one in his own house would ever look there. Inside were folders, neatly labeled in his careful counselor's handwriting, not client files. Those, I later learned, lived at the school, locked under district protocol. These were personal case studies, he might have called them, if he'd been asked to defend them in a room full of professionals instead of hiding them in his own home. One folder was labeled Rebecca, M. Timline. My hands were shaking hard enough that I dropped my phone twice trying to photograph the pages. Weeks of entries, dates, times, notes in a shorthand that took me a full read-through to parse. R cried at 40, restart, R held to 0, praised for control. I sat on the floor of his office with my back against the desk and read entry after entry, and somewhere around the 15th one, my stomach did the thing Diane had warned me it would do. That specific physical drop, like missing a stair in the dark. I told myself it was still, technically, possible this was some sanctioned research project, some pilot program the district had authorized and simply not told me about. I photographed everything, 41 pages. Then I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, taped the key back under the desk, and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make my hands steady enough to drive to Diane's office. The second loop came from Maya herself, 10 days later, in the unremarkable way that the worst truths usually arrive, sideways in the middle of something else. We were making grilled cheese. She was standing on the step stool watching the butter melt, and she said, out of nowhere, "Daddy says Rebecca's mommy doesn't know about the sessions." I kept my voice as flat as the spatula in my hand. "What sessions, baby?" "The water ones. He said it's a secret because Rebecca's mommy would get scared and it would ruin the progress." "Does Rebecca come here a lot?" "Only on Thursdays, when you have your book club." I did not have book club on Thursdays. I had never had book club on any day in my entire adult life. It was, I realized with a sick little jolt, a detail he'd invented to explain my predictable absence. Thursday evenings, I picked up an extra shift covering claims for a coworker on maternity leave, a schedule Caleb knew cold, because he was the one who'd suggested I take the shift in the first place. He'd built my own absence into his plan, using my own schedule. That was the moment I understood this wasn't impulsive. This was architecture. I called Diane from the pantry, whispering, while Maya ate her sandwich at the table 12 feet away. "He's been running it on a schedule he set up around my job," I said. "He recommended the Thursday shift to me 8 months ago." There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a person recalculating a case in real time. "Sarah, I need you to hear this clearly. What you're describing isn't a marriage problem anymore. This is a pattern of premeditated, concealed contact with a minor who is not his own child, and your daughter is describing herself as a participant in the same activity. I have to bring in a mandated reporter. This is a pattern of premeditated, concealed contact with a minor who is not his own child, and your daughter is describing herself as a participant in the same activity. I have to bring in a mandated reporter today, not next week. Today. The third loop was the hardest one, because it was the one where the system almost failed us before it helped us. Diane connected me with Marcus Webb, a detective with the Financial and Special Crimes Unit, not, as I'd expected, Family Services, because Diane wanted someone with subpoena power for financial and digital records right away, someone who could move faster than a standard CPS timeline. Detective Webb had spent 14 years investigating cases that crossed the line between domestic and institutional abuse, cases involving people with professional cover. He had a voice like gravel and the patience of a man who'd learned that rushing a case was how you lost it. Our first meeting, in a gray interview room that smelled like old coffee, he laid it out plainly. Here's the problem you're going to run into, Mrs. Sterling. Your husband is a licensed, credentialed school counselor with 12 years of clean record and glowing reviews. You're describing something that sounds like unauthorized, unsupervised behavioral conditioning of a minor, potentially 2 minors, counting your daughter. But right now what I have is photographs of handwritten notes and a 7-year-old's comment about grilled cheese. A good defense attorney tears through that in about 4 minutes. So what do you need? I need Rebecca's mother to confirm she never authorized these sessions. I need the school district to confirm whether any of this was sanctioned in any form, ever. And I need something that isn't secondhand, something that shows him doing it, in real time, in his own words. That last part was the hardest ask, and he knew it. You want me to record him. I want you to understand that if you do, and you do it wrong, it can get thrown out and it can also get you charged depending on your state's consent laws. We're a one-party consent state, which helps. You can legally record a conversation you're a part of without telling him, but I need you to let me walk you through exactly how, so it holds up. I remember sitting in that room and feeling something shift in me, not courage exactly, more like the moment a scale finally tips, when you've been standing frozen on the edge of a decision so long that your legs go numb, and then suddenly your body just decides for you. Tell me how, I said. The fourth loop was finding Rebecca's mother. Her name was Talia Reyes. She'd been a student of Caleb's counseling practicum 11 years earlier, at a school 2 districts over, long before Ridgeline. She'd reconnected with him at a district-wide parenting seminar the previous spring. He'd offered, out of the goodness of his heart, some free consultation for her daughter's anxiety. Given his expertise, Talia was a single mother working 2 jobs, and a free in-home session from a credentialed professional had seemed to her like an enormous kindness. I found her through the seminar's sign-in sheet, which Diane's paralegal pulled through a public records request to the district. When I called her, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit on the kitchen floor to keep the phone steady. Talia, I know this is going to sound insane. My name is Sarah Sterling. I think our daughters have been in sessions together, with my husband, without your knowledge. The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought she'd hung up. She comes home smelling like our pool chemicals, Talia finally said, voice cracking. I thought she was going to a friend's house. He said he had a system with the co-op after-school program that it counted as enrichment hours. Talia, there's no co-op program. There's no enrichment hours. It's happening at my house, in my bathtub. I heard her start to cry, and then I heard something else in her voice, the same thing that had been rising in me for weeks, underneath the fear. Rage. Arriving late, but arriving hard. I want to see everything you have, she said. And then I want to talk to your detective. Between the 4th and 5th loops, there was a beat I didn't expect, and it was almost the one that ended everything before it started. Caleb noticed I'd taken time off on a Thursday. He didn't say anything directly. That wasn't his style. He mentioned, almost in passing over dinner, that he'd run into my supervisor, Ron, at the gas station, and Ron had said something about my flexible schedule lately. He watched my face while he said it, the way he used to watch Maya's face across the dinner table when he was gauging whether a lesson had landed. I told him Ron was probably confused, that I'd swapped a shift with a coworker, and I made myself finish my dinner at a normal pace, made myself ask him about his day like it was any other Tuesday, and later that night, I sat in the closet with my phone light dimmed to nothing and texted Diane in a panic. I think he suspects something. What do I do? Diane called me back within 4 minutes, which I'd come to understand, by then, was not normal for a family attorney with a full caseload. It was a signal of how seriously she'd started taking the case. Don't change your behavior, she said. Don't cancel anything, don't get quiet, don't get affectionate to overcompensate. He'll read any deviation as data. Keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Predictability is your camouflage right now. It was, I think, the single hardest piece of advice I followed during the entire ordeal. Harder than the recording, harder than the filing cabinet. Sitting across from a man I now understood to be capable of holding 2 little girls under cold water until they stopped crying, and forcing myself to laugh at his joke about the neighbor's new fence. I got very good that month at being an actress in my own kitchen. 1. I still don't know what that says about me. Diane told me later that it's what almost every survivor she's worked with eventually learns how to do, and that she'd stopped being surprised by how capable, ordinary, terrified people turn out to be under pressure. I didn't feel capable. I felt like I was drowning in exactly the kind of water I was trying to pull my daughter out of. The 5th loop was the recording, and it was the one that nearly broke me. Detective Webb walked me through it in a session that felt more like rehearsal for a play than police work. What to say, what not to say, how to keep him talking without leading him, how to stay calm enough that my own voice on the tape wouldn't sound coached. Don't accuse him, Webb said. Ask him to explain. People like your husband, people who believe fully in their own righteousness, they don't confess, they justify. Give him room to justify, and he'll hand you everything. I wore Maya to a sleepover at Priya's that Thursday. The Thursday he thought was my shift. The Thursday I'd told my supervisor I needed off, for the first time in 3 years, without explanation. I sat in my kitchen with a phone recording in my sweater pocket and waited for him to come home, and when he walked in, keys jingling, whistling something from the radio, I almost lost my nerve completely. "You're home early," he said, kissing my cheek like it was any other Thursday, like there wasn't a stopwatch-shaped hole blown through the center of our marriage. "I wanted to ask you about the sessions," I said. "With Rebecca, I want to understand the method, for Maya's sake." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, then something almost like pleasure, the specific pleasure of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask him to explain his genius. "It's called controlled dysregulation recovery," he said, pulling out a chair, sitting across from me like we were colleagues at a case conference. "Most therapists are too soft. They let a child sit in their anxiety, coddle it, and the anxiety just calcifies. My method interrupts the loop at the somatic level. Cold water is a reset trigger. Counting gives them an external locus of control. If they cry before completing the sequence, they haven't achieved regulation, so we begin again." "How many times have you done this with Maya?" "Since she was 5. It's why she's excelling in school, Sarah. You've seen her focus." "And Rebecca?" 6 months. Her mother would never understand the science." "Neither, apparently, do you." His voice cooled by several degrees. "I'd hoped you'd trust my judgment on this the way you trusted on everything else. Have you ever held either of them under the water?" A pause. "Long enough that I felt my heart trying to climb out of my throat." "Only until they understand the stakes," he said. "It's never dangerous. I'm trained in this, Sarah. I know exactly how long a child can hold their breath before it becomes anything more than discomfort." I sat very still, both hands flat on the table so he wouldn't see them shake, while my husband explained in complete, patient sentences exactly how he had been conditioning our daughter and another man's child through simulated drowning disguised as therapy. 41 minutes of recording. Detective Webb told me later it was the cleanest confession he'd gotten off book in his entire career. Everything after that moved faster than I could keep pace with, which Diane told me was normal, that once real evidence exists, the machinery of the system, slow and skeptical as it had been, suddenly remembers how to run. Detective Webb executed a search warrant on the house 2 days later, the same house where 6 weeks earlier, a different kind of warrant had flashed through my mind as an absurd, impossible thing that only happened to other people. They took the filing cabinet's full contents. They took his laptop, his phone, the stopwatch itself, bagged and tagged like it was a murder weapon, which in a sense it was. A weapon aimed at the part of 2 little girls that was supposed to feel safe in water for the rest of their lives. Ridgeline Middle School placed Caleb on immediate administrative leave the same week, once the district's council was notified. Dr. Patricia Nwosu, the assistant superintendent, called me personally, a call I hadn't expected and almost didn't take, certain it would be another voice defending him. It wasn't. "Mrs. Sterling, I want you to know we're conducting a full internal review, and I've already referred the matter to our licensing board contact. If what's been described to us is accurate, Mr. Sterling will not work in this district again, and I intend to make sure he doesn't work with children anywhere else either." The forensic accountant Diane brought in, a sharp, unflappable woman named Renata Cole, CFE, who specialized in tracing digital footprints alongside financial ones, found something I hadn't even thought to look for: a private online forum, password protected, where Caleb had been posting under an alias for 3 years, describing his methodology to a small group of other self-styled behavioral practitioners, soliciting feedback on resistance thresholds and optimal restart intervals, like he was workshopping a recipe. 14 other members. Renata's report went straight to Webb, and Webb's report went to a task force that, over the following 4 months, would open investigations in 3 additional states. I want to tell you the district attorney's office moved with total confidence from the start, but that wouldn't be honest. There was a week, the worst week, where the assistant DA assigned to the case, a cautious man named Owen Pruitt, told Diane he was worried the recording might get suppressed on a technicality, that Caleb's attorney was arguing the whole conversation had been elicited under emotional duress and shouldn't count as a voluntary statement. I remember sitting in Diane's office when she told me that, feeling the floor tilt under me the way it had in the bathroom that first night. What happens if it gets thrown out? Then, we go to trial with Rebecca's testimony, Maya's forensic interview, the notebooks, And the forum posts, Diane said. It's still a strong case. It's just not the case we want. The recording is the difference between a plea deal today and a trial that puts 2 7-year-olds on a witness stand. For 6 days, I didn't sleep more than 2 hours a night. I kept the stopwatch's photo on my phone, not because I needed the reminder, but because some nights it was the only thing that made the whole ordeal feel real instead of like a nightmare I might wake from into my old, ignorant life. On the 7th day, the judge ruled the recording admissible. One-party consent, clean chain of custody, no coercion established. Diane called me at 4:12 p.m., and I sat down on my kitchen floor, the same spot where I'd called Talia weeks earlier, and cried for the first time since the bathtub. Not from fear this time, from something closer to relief. Though relief isn't quite the right word for what it feels like when the worst thing you know about your husband finally becomes undeniable to everyone else too. Before the plea, there was one more hearing I hadn't been prepared for, a bail modification request, where Caleb's attorney argued for reduced supervision so he could continue contributing financially to his daughter's welfare ahead of trial. It was Dr. Vasquez, of all people, who ended up in that courtroom, not to testify about Caleb, but to submit a written clinical opinion on the risk that any unsupervised or loosely supervised contact posed to Maya's ongoing recovery. She'd spent 4 sessions building a picture of exactly how conditioned Maya's nervous system had become around her father's presence, how even the sound of a man's footsteps in the hallway at bath time still made her go rigid. The judge read 2 paragraphs of it aloud in open court. I watched the color drain out of Caleb's face for the first time since I'd known him. Not at the accusation itself, I think, but at hearing, in clean clinical language, the exact kind of report he used to write about other people's children, now written about the damage he'd done to his own. The modification was denied. Bail conditions tightened instead of loosened. It was a small thing, procedurally, but it was the first moment I let myself believe the system might actually hold. Caleb took a plea 11 days later. 2 counts of child endangerment, 1 count of unlawful restraint of a minor, and because of the forum, because of the 14 other members, because Renata's forensic trail led somewhere much larger than our bathtub, a federal count tied to distribution of instructional material related to child abuse across state lines. 8 years with mandatory registration and a lifetime ban from any occupation involving contact with minors. His name was in the paper before the ink was dry on the plea. Oak Creek Gazette, then the local news, then, because these things travel now, a regional outlet, then a true crime podcast that got some of the details wrong, but got the essential shape of it right. The counselor everyone trusted, running a private laboratory of cruelty disguised as therapy, in his own home, on his own daughter, and to strangers. The parents who'd once driven from 3 districts over to get their kids on his caseload started calling the school in a panic, asking if their own children had ever been alone with him. Dr. Nwosu told me later that the district ended up conducting 63 follow-up interviews. Most turned up nothing. 4 did not. I think about those 4 more than I think about almost anything else from that entire year. There is no clean way to describe what the months afterward were like, so I won't pretend there was. Maya started seeing a trauma therapist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, PsyD, who specialized in child victims of caregiver-perpetrated psychological abuse, a specific enough specialty that I hated on some visceral level, that it needed to exist at all, that there were enough children like my daughter for someone to build a career around helping them. The counting didn't stop right away. Dr. Vasquez told me that was expected, that you don't undo 2 years of conditioning in a few sessions, that the goal wasn't to erase the behavior overnight, but to slowly disconnect it from fear, to let Maya count because she liked numbers, the way other kids like dinosaurs or horses, instead of counting because her nervous system believed her survival depended on reaching 0 without crying. It took 8 months before I heard her count out loud without the particular breathless urgency that used to make my chest seize. 9 months before she splashed in a bath without flinching at the sound of running water. I remember standing in the doorway that night, a different doorway now. We'd moved to a rental across town within 3 weeks of the arrest, unable to stay in that house, and watching her blow bubbles with a plastic cup, laughing at nothing, and I had to leave the room so she wouldn't see me cry. Talia and I stayed close. Rebecca and Maya, it turned out, needed each other in a way neither of us had expected. 2 little girls who shared something almost no one else in their lives could understand, who could sit together and simply exist without either of them having to explain the specific waterlogged shape of their fear. We started a standing Sunday brunch, the 4 of us. It became the thing I looked forward to most in a week that, for a long time, otherwise felt like wading through wet cement. I quit the insurance job 14 months later, not because I had to. Caleb's assets, once seized and the restitution order settled, left Maya and me stable enough, but because Detective Webb, of all people, had planted something in me during those long interview sessions. He told me once, almost offhand, that half his best case referrals over the years had come from people who'd lived through exactly what I had and couldn't stand to watch it happen to someone else without doing something about it. I went back to school for victim advocacy. I finished the certification 11 months ago. I now work alongside people like Renata Cole and Detective Webb on the other side of the table this time. The person who sits across from a terrified spouse or parent and says, "I know this feels impossible, and I promise you it isn't." Maya is 9 now. She still counts sometimes, but differently. She counts the stairs on the way to bed. She counts the ceiling tiles at the pediatrician's office. Ordinary, boring, 7 going on 9-year-old counting, untethered from fear, exactly the way Dr. E. Vasquez said it eventually would be, though I hadn't fully believed her the day she said it. Last month, I found the stopwatch in an evidence release envelope Detective Webb's office mailed back to me. A formality, he explained. Now that the case was fully closed and appeals exhausted, I sat with it in my lap for a long time before I decided what to do with it. I didn't throw it in a drawer. I didn't keep it as some grim trophy on a shelf, either. I drove out to the county recycling center on a Saturday morning. Maya buckled in the back seat, and I let her drop it into the metal bin herself. It made a small, unremarkable clatter against a pile of other broken, discarded things. Hair dryers, toasters, whatever else people had decided they no longer needed. "What was that thing again?" she asked. Already climbing back into her booster seat, already thinking about pancakes, the way I'd promised her. "Just an old clock," I said. "It doesn't work anymore." She nodded, satisfied, and looked out the window at the ordinary Saturday morning going by. Kids on bikes, a man walking a dog, sunlight doing nothing more sinister than warming the pavement. I put the car in drive and didn't look back at the bin. Some things I've learned you don't need to watch disappear to know they're finally truly gone. You just need to know you're the one who let go of them, on your own terms, in your own time, and that this time, nobody's counting down but you.